Some mistakes are understandable. Others are so improbable that the deeper you dig, the more convinced you become that they're really a miracle. Richard Dawkins pulled off one of those miraculous mistakes in his 2006 documentary, The Root of All Evil, and it nullifies the entire point he was trying to make by telling this story.
I do remember one formative influence in my undergraduate life. There was an elderly professor in my department who had been passionately keen on a particular theory for, a number of years. And one day an American visiting researcher came and he completely and utterly disproved our old man's hypothesis. The old man strode to the front, shook his hand and said, "My dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I have been wrong these 15 years. And we all clapped our hands raw. That was the scientific ideal of somebody who had a lot invested, a lifetime almost invested into theory. And he was rejoicing that he had been shown wrong and that scientific truth had been advanced.
He wasn't just reminiscing. He told that story for a reason. What's it there to prove? I presume it's supposed to show us that while scientists are flexible in their beliefs and willing, eager to admit when their beliefs differ from the truth, religious people are unreasonably stubborn in clinging to their ideas. But does it prove that? It might seem to prove its case to somebody like Dawkins because, despite his best arguments, religious people stubbornly cling to the idea that there's a God. But stubbornness can't be the problem Dawkins has. Consider this excerpt from his 2014 interview with Peter Boghossian. Dawkins admits that if God himself were to show him miraculous evidence of his existence, he would simply dismiss it as a hallucination.
What would it take for you to believe in God?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus or a great, big, deep, booming bass Paul Robeson voice saying, "I am God and I created." But I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, richarddawkins.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or.
Notice, in the clip, it is God himself doing the proving. Yet Dawkins and Boghossian are looking for ways to say that what they've experienced is not what they've experienced. I find it jarring to watch a video in which two thought leaders ask themselves, what mental gymnastics am I willing to do to give me a plausible way to stay wrong? It's hard to think of a way to be more stubborn than that. But let's ignore Dawkins' attitude and take his story seriously for a moment. We'll unpack it and see what it's really made of and ask. As compared to science, as it's actually practiced, is religious thought really just stubbornness? So we have Dawkins' story about a scientist admitting error after years of championing a theory. Intellectual humility is an admirable ideal. So what are the odds that there's a story in the religious literature studied to this very day that tells an extremely similar story praising the exact same intellectual humility? I mean, it seems unlikely, right? Everything you might have been taught about religion says such a story shouldn't exist. Worse, it would undermine Dawkins' efforts to contrast humble science with stubborn religion if such a story existed. And in fact, there is such a story, right there in the Talmud. Now, there's no reason to expect a specialist in biology to know anything about the Talmud and the stories it contains. But here's the irony. In the exact same documentary, Richard Dawkins interviews a rabbi. He could have asked him about intellectual humility as a Jewish ideal. He could have been genuinely curious in exploring the beliefs of others. What he actually did was hector the rabbi about the age of the universe.
You realize they're being taught that the entire world began after what archaeologists would recognize as the agricultural revolution.
As a lawyer, I find this scene particularly striking. If you're going to go to trial and putting out a persuasive documentary that has to stand the test of time shares a lot in common with going to trial. You have to search diligently for the facts that will torpedo your case. Otherwise, you'll need to contact your malpractice carrier. It's very much like a scientist looking for ways to falsify his hypothesis. How ironic that Dawkins didn't do so. But why didn't he? No doubt he thought he already knew what was in the rabbi's head. How did he know what the rabbi thought and believed? Well, I guess he shut himself away and thought about it. He just thought private thoughts inside his own head and convinced himself that it just had to be so.
He shut himself away and thought about it. He just thought private thoughts inside his own head and convinced himself, no doubt on tortuous theological grounds, that it just had to be so.
So, here's the story in the Talmud. It was taught. Shimon HaAmmassoni, and some say it was Nehemiah HaAmmassoni, would interpret all the occurrences of the word et in the Torah, deriving additional laws and guidance from that word. Let me explain. The word et is the object marker in Hebrew. This little bit of grammar is extremely common in the Torah. It appears twice in the very first verse. Now, there's no exact parallel to that word in the English language, but for our purposes, it's like saying he wrote a short essay on what the word do adds to each sentence in Hamlet. Once Shimon reached the verse, "You shall be in awe of the Lord your God," he couldn't find the answer. How can anybody or anything compare to God, right? He withdrew from his method of exposition. After years of work, he admitted his error, just like the scientist in Richard Dawkins' story. His students said to him, "Rabbi, what will you do with all the etim that you interpreted until now?" He said to them, "Just as I received a reward for the interpretation, so shall I receive reward for putting away my work." They didn't just clap their hands raw to honor Shimon HaAmmassoni. They wrote it down. They retold the story generation after generation for thousands of years. School children learn it to this day. And now you too know that story. But there's more to it than that, so much more. And the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that Dawkins' dichotomy doesn't hold up. Let's have a closer look. Reb Shimon applied himself to his project successfully until he was 80% of the way through, until he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I don't know how many of you have invested the time and the love and the effort and the attention that it takes to complete a large creative project. I've often said that plotting out a novel isn't just solving one problem, it's solving 10,000 problems. Solve one, and thousands more await. The best I could determine, there are approximately 5,500 occurrences of the word et in the Torah. I'm sure that pouring all that attention and thought into the project was an immense challenge. But it wasn't just a mental effort that Shimon HaAmmassoni expended. Think of the physical effort. In the days before word processing, indeed, in the days before ballpoint pens, he took a quill and dipped it in ink and wrote out each of thousands of short essays. When I went to college, we used to have to write out our essay exams by hand with a pen in a blue book. I used to dread how my hand would cramp up as I struggled to write out answers neatly enough for the professor to read. Well, Shimon didn't even have paper to write on. It hadn't been invented yet. He had papyrus, which isn't as smooth as paper and not nearly as easy to write on. Or he could have used parchment, which is expensive. So with thousands of essays to write, how much must he have spent on that project? And that's not all. He told his students what he was up to. Remember, they asked him about what he was going to do with the work he'd already done? If he averaged one essay per day, it would have taken him more than 15 years to complete the project. He probably told an entire generation of students what he was up to. And then he had to admit failure. What must that have felt like? How tempted must he have been just to slide one past them, to take a shortcut, I guess a novelist could get away with a deus ex machina, a plot contrivance that gets the characters where they need to go. I never did it, but I sure felt that temptation. That's not what Shimon did either. He admitted his error and went on to the next project. Which takes us back to the scientists. Of course, not all scientists fall short, but do all or even most scientists live up to Richard Dawkins' ideal? Well, if they did, there would be no such thing as the reproducibility crisis. You ever heard of the 4 horsemen of the reproducibility crisis? Oxford professor Richard Dawkins should have known about it. If not, he could have asked fellow Oxford professor Dorothy Bishop about it. If he did, she could tell him about the problematic research practices that scientists use to patch up faulty theories that are not borne out by their experiments. Practices like p-hacking, or low statistical power, or harking, which is hypothesizing after the results are known, and publication bias. I'll link Professor Bishop's talk in the description. Worse yet, I wish that was the only problematic research practice that scientists use to patch up their faulty theories. Let me tell you a story about what's at stake when scientists don't do their jobs as promised. Have a look at this woman. She was an engineer at NASA, and she's holding the tapes that she helped to design to record the rockets that took men to the moon. This photograph was taken in 1968, when women engineers at NASA were rare. I met a number of such women. When I was in law school in the 1990s, we were taught by several women who had come through training in that era. They were some of the most tough and determined people you'll ever meet. Geraldine Kaplan, the woman in that picture, was cut from the same cloth. She was also my mother-in-law. What must she have been like in those days? My family was devastated to watch her decline horribly with Alzheimer's. So imagine my white-hot rage when I learned that a neuroscientist named Sylvain Lisney faked the brain scans behind his Alzheimer's theory in a paper cited thousands of times, guiding billions of dollars of research funding. If scientists had all lived up to the ideals Dawkins celebrates, Lisney would have looked at the true scans, admitted he was wrong, and turned to other research. Maybe that research would have led to a cure. Maybe then my mother-in-law would still be here watching her grandchildren grow up. If he did, I would have personally clapped my hands raw for his contribution to mankind. Stories like his are as unlikely to make it to atheist polemics as the story of Shimon HaAmmassoni. Unlike the story of Sylvain Lisney, Reb Shimon's story has a happy ending. The word et in this verse was not explained until Rabbi Akiva came and expounded, "You shall be in awe of the Lord your God." The word et comes to include those who spend their lives studying God's Torah to discover God's will. One is commanded to be in awe of them, just as one is in awe of God. Because when they do that, as it's supposed to be done, they live up to that ideal of the seeker of truth. If you like this video and want more inspiring content, hit like and subscribe to my channel. If Richard Dawkins ever commented on Sylvain Lisney's stain on the reputation of science, I am unaware of it. If he did do that, leave a link in the comments below.